Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. The African National Congress has had its policy conference discussing key economic questions. One of them is the issue of whether South Africa's mines should be nationalized. There's been a lot of confusion over what exactly the parties decided. Today, my guest is ANC Secretary General Gwede Mantashe, and he's going to unpack these issues as well as the ANC's position on the land question. Mr. Mantashe, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, you've had the policy conference. COSATU has just had its elective conference. And of course, at that conference, you invited the Trade Union Federation to make input into the ANC's policy positions, particularly on the issue of nationalisation. And you were quoted as saying the ANC is looking at nationalising strategic assets. Can you just explain what exactly the party means by that?
No, we've used a term called strategic nationalisation.
Unpack that for us. What does it mean?
And we qualified it by saying on the balance of evidence, meaning that there is no drive here to go up mopping up every strategic mineral. But the state will have to take a more active and in terms of ownership and control. But it's not going to go to all the minerals. It will look into the strategic nature of minerals. That is what the policy conference resolved. And I said to the Federation, we're in a process of saying, what are these strategic minerals? So that by the time we go to December, we're not still generalizing. We say, here are the 6 minerals that we regard as strategic, or 5, or whatever number. And say, then we're going to be active there. And we'll look into using the state-owned mining company as a vehicle to be a custodian of state interest in mining. It is already operational. It's running one coal mine. It is beginning to make small profits now. It has gone past the break-even point. And once you do that, you can grow. That means you can partner with the private sector, depending on the capacity. If that capacity grows, at a point, you will take it into go it alone in some of the mining company mines and run a mine fully fledged. The reason that we took that decision is that we understand that wholesale nationalization, or explicit about that, is not going to work.
Okay, let me clarify that quickly. You're saying wholesale nationalization is not an option, but yes, off the back of your comments around strategic, yes, nationalizing strategic assets, yes, one of the groups, for example, the Youth League, yes, was saying they're very encouraged because you're coming round to their point of view. And of course, we know that they are talking about wholesale nationalization. So make that distinction for us, Mr. Mantashe.
No, I don't think my responsibility is to make a decision between the ANC and its league. The ANC develops policy. Leagues makes proposals to policy development in the ANC. I must clarify the views of the ANC because that is what constitutes a policy. Yes. So when we talk of that strategic nationalization, that's why we were attracted to some arrangement like the Botswana arrangement and other arrangements. It may not be a 50-50, it may be 50-50 in one instance, it may be 70-30 in another, it may be 60-40 in another, depending on the capacity of the state mining company and the arrangement between that company and a private sector company that will run the private sector interests. Now,
in your question, or rather in answer to my first question about evidence-based, that the ANC will look at the evidence, one of the minerals that were identified in your research report, the SIMS report, was of course platinum, and it has a lot to do with the fact that 80% of the world's deposits are in South Africa. Is the ANC considering declaring platinum a strategic mineral?
I'm sure platinum will be one of the minerals looked at. I don't want to preempt the process, but what I'm saying is that the nature of the mineral, which means platinum and the role it is playing in terms of manufacturing, particularly auto manufacturing, makes it very strategic. I would imagine that if we want to be big in steel, we'll have to look into iron ore, manganese, chrome. If we want to be big in energy, we'll have to look into minerals like coal. I have my own questions. I don't know what the ETC will say, But I have my questions about uranium, because in South Africa, you hardly find a standalone uranium mining company. You normally find uranium as a byproduct of gold. And to me, getting into gold by the state at this late stage would actually force the state to take over more liabilities than assets. And I think all those discussions will be factored in deciding what is regarded as strategic mineral.
Now, at the policy conference, there were reports that you, for example, were arguing that the state's equity share needs to be increased to something like 30%. What is the thinking, Secretary General, in the African National Congress about the stake that the state should be having? What figures are we talking about?
The reason that the resolution left it at strategic nationalization on the balance of evidence is because there can be no one figure fitting all. And when that argument was put forward, everybody was convinced, including myself, that it will be dependent on the mineral by mineral and on the issues that are there. For example, one of the things you will have to take into account is the cost of actually sinking that shaft and developing the infrastructure. If you are expecting your partner to play a big role in developing that infrastructure, that will be factored in determining the share of the state in that particular mine.
So if I'm to understand you correctly, Mr. Mantashe, are you saying that it will depend on, if we're talking coal, what the percentage would be? If you're talking gold, what the percentage would be? Would you actually go mineral by mineral?
It will depend on many things, circumstances around that mineral. Let me give an example. If you are partnering with a company for a deep mine, obviously, and you are expecting that company to put a lot of money in that capital outlay, I'm sure the state share will be lower. If you are going to an open cast, where the mineral is close to the surface, you need a front-end loader to remove the surface soil and then you get into the mineral, I would imagine that the state ownership will be higher. But it requires something else. It also required scientific geological mapping, where we know exactly what is where. And when you have that geological mapping and the state knows where the mineral is, it can have a bigger control on the allocation of those minerals.
Now, there's been many subsequent gatherings of various role players on the issue of the mineral energy complex in South Africa. And one of the important social partners is, of course, business. And there's been noises from that sector that it's very difficult for them to input the ANC policy process. Of course, they're not necessarily ANC members. How does the ANC foresee business inputting into the policy discussion of the African National Congress on such an important question such as mining policy?
I'm sure that would be an analyst who says that, because the chamber was here in our boardroom one day with 10 CEOs. We had a very fruitful discussion. That engagement continues. So if an analyst says he doesn't know how business inputs, the Chamber of Mines know exactly how to input in the ANC policy.
So in terms of your observation, you feel that you've got the key players in the industry on board and they are able to actually discern very clearly where the ANC's thinking is going?
The engagement is that there's a great degree of agreement with the industry as well. They are not hostile to the state involvement in terms of ownership and control. They are not hostile to the mining company. They are not hostile to a number of issues. But where I think we're going to have to engage is the details. That's where the devil is. Yes, it's in the detail. Because I would imagine that they will want to bargain for other things that they are concerned. And that process will have to continue.
Mm-hmm. Now, this engagement that you've had with industry, did you discuss, for example, the issue of taxes and the windfall tax? Because that has been something that they have raised concerns with. What is the ANC's feeling? And in your engagement with the sector, what is the concern that they're raising on this issue particularly?
No, the tax, there are a number of issues regarding the rate, the windfall tax, the royalties, and all those is a package of taxes, the tax regime that will be in place. That is an issue that is under discussion. And I think we have to look into those issues.
But where are we, SG? Can you give us some progress? What is the ANC prepared to settle for if business raise objections, for example, with any aspect of that tax regime?
You see, Karima, we don't develop policy on the basis of objection from business. The business inputs in the policy of actually rolling out ideas. And the final arbiter is the policy conference of the ANC in December. And everybody...
In the elective conference.
Yes, that is the national conference of the ANC. That national policy is the policy that determine policy, because that policy is not about elections only. That's why the term elective conference is just capturing a small part of that conference. That conference is about policies and constitution of the ANC and programs of the ANC. Once it takes decision, that's why we gather there for 5 days. Once those decisions are taken, they become policy of the ANC. Then you use the policy to engage anybody. At this point in time, any input that comes in is trying to influence that outcome. But the basis of serious engagement will be that outcome.
Take us through, issue. Many people want to know, once a policy is decided in the African National Congress, as the ruling party, how does the ruling party go about implementing that policy? How does that policy, morph into legislation, for example?
If it requires legislation, it is given over it is put into parliamentary process. There's no shortcut about that. But ANC activists and ANC MPs will be part of understanding the policy formulation, and therefore they will know the policy. That's why when they go there, they talk as MPs, but they factor in the policy framework that came out of policy formulation. That's why we're a governing party, because we go to the electorate on the basis of our policies. Now, we can't go to government and refuse to implement them when we actually won election on the basis of those policies. Then MPs are obliged to actually process those policies through, because that is the basis of winning elections.
And of course, that is a process that goes through the normal process of green papers, where you get yes, input, white papers and so on. So if we're talking timeframes, SG, say for example, we have a change in, let's say, the tax regimes as it concerns mining. What kind of time frame would one anticipate if one takes into consideration all that you've just outlined?
The time frame is 5 years. Let me tell you why I call it 5 years. It's because we go to a conference of the ANC, we're elected for a term of 5 years. So that means that 5 years is the time frame for our implementation. Others will be implemented in year 1, year 2, year 3, but that is the framework. And the team that will be elected in 2014 into parliament, it will have another 5-year term for implementing. So during that period, they must create proper priorities, prioritize issues that are urgent, but we have a term of 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's just come back to the issues underpinning the thinking in the ANC around state involvement. So we've established wholesale nationalisation is off the table, but there will be a decided role for the state, the details of which is to be worked out. Take us through the best practices of other countries. You've referred, for example, to the Botswana example, but your research team went to, I think, 14 countries. What countries are you looking at for examples that could work in the South African conditions?
No, you can, it's a combination. For example, if you go to Chile and Brazil, they're using state-owned mining companies as a driving force, structured in different ways. Others put emphasis on the percentage. Brazil doesn't put emphasis on percentage. It owns 30%, but have an arrangement of the dividend sharing as the key. So and then we'll look into all those aspects and try to borrow the best practices, adapt them to our situation. Botswana is more attractive in terms of ownership. And if you go to China, for example, it's a combination of state ownership, control, and management, because there the state is much deeper involved. Many people believe that China is owning things. China has opened up a great deal. It gives people, some companies, 49% of their companies. The difference is that they give them on companies that already exist, but bringing in more efficiency and more productivity. And it works well for them. So we'll have to borrow various aspects from the various countries. That's why the research covered a whole range of countries.
Now, of course, the big issue around whether the state is involved, whether you de-racialize the economy, has got to do with dealing with the issues underpinning South African society, which is inequality, joblessness, poverty. we've had a black economic empowerment or a broad-based black economic empowerment policy, but has that policy in relation to mining, for example, impacted on the social conditions of workers? We've just had the Marikana crisis, where it's very clear that just changing ownership in terms of getting black people into companies doesn't automatically lead to a change for ordinary workers and communities.
It's exactly the myth that must be removed from the nationalization debate. That myth must be removed, because there is a myth created in this debate that once the state takes over, it will distribute cash to everybody. And there's no state-owned mining company works that way. A state-owned company operates on the same principle as any other company. It must generate that surplus. The redistribution happens through the state putting money in issues that benefit the poor. The poor are not going to be given cash. The poor will be given schools. The poor will be given better quality of health. The poor will be given roads. They will be given all sorts of issues that impact on their lives, general as a society. That's what redistribution is all about. So this myth of a state that distributes cash is actually a myth.
SG, we have to leave it there for a while. We're taking a short break. When we come back, we continue our discussion with the Secretary General of the African National Congress on policy questions affecting mining and land in South Africa.